Chapter 8, Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Who is like the wise? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when a man had power over man to his hurt. All right, are there authorities on the earth? Yes. He starts off with this question. Well, he starts off with the question, who is like the wise, which I think is a fair question to ask. He has said earlier, now this is, of course, an inspired Solomon who's writing. And we talked about this, I think, last week as well. Was Solomon a wise man? Yes. Where did Solomon get his wisdom? From God. How wise was Solomon? What does the Bible say about that? There was no one before him, nor anyone after him, who had the measure of wisdom that he enjoyed. And Solomon, by inspiration, writes and says that he comes to the conclusion that he is not wise. If Solomon says by inspiration that he is not wise, who in this room believes that they are? Now understand what we're talking about here, though. He's prodding and looking and examining things and trying to understand and grasp the depths of things, and ultimately, who is wise? And where does all wisdom come from? God is wise, and all wisdom comes from God. And so when he asks that question, who is like the wise, I think it's sort of like asking the question, who is like God? Who knows the interpretation of a thing? That second question is connected to the first question. It reminds me, well, of a lot of people. Joseph, for one. Joseph was a man who came to be ruler in Egypt because he was able to do what? Interpret things and give the interpretation and give the instruction and wisdom that arises from that interpretation. Where did he get that power from? He got it from God. That was God. And in fact, he was careful to credit God and say that this is God, not me. Daniel was the same way. And so, who knows the interpretation? Who knows, who understands what's really going on in the world? Who understands why things are the way they are? Who can interpret what's happening and give full explanation as to why? Can any man do that? No. Only God can. And I think that's the point. A man's wisdom makes his face shine. We're proud of ourselves. But it doesn't mean that we have the ability to give the interpretation. And I'm not talking about give the interpretation of something you read, or I'm talking about giving the interpretation about why things are the way they are. Why this government is raised up as opposed to a different one. Romans 13 suggests that all governments get their authority from where? From God. Does that mean that Babylon was raised up by God? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, the Bible tells us it was way back when Babylon was getting raised up. In fact, it tells us Babylon was going to be raised up by God before it even was. Did everything Babylon do reflect righteousness and good? No. So why? Why did God raise up Nebuchadnezzar? Why did God allow these nations like Assyria to rise up and do the terrible things that they did? Why did God allow Hitler to rise to power? Yes, sir.
I want to disappoint you with this answer, but it's the truth. Who knows? But I was thinking about something I remember Paul said in Romans. If he was talking about Israel and even Pharaoh, he says, I think he quoted a scripture saying, how unsearchable are God's judgments. And I think that falls into that.
Okay, I agree. And who knows is actually the right answer, because that's where he started, right? Who is like the wise? Who knows the interpretation of a thing? The point that he's doing, he's laying a foundation. He's fixing to talk about our attitude toward the king, and he's laying the foundation for his conclusion, which is we should be careful and we should respect the king. And be real careful to not jump to conclusions and become the adversary of the king. And what Romans 13 suggests when we get into that discussion much later in the Revelation is that when we make ourselves enemies of the government that God has raised, we make ourselves enemies potentially of God himself. God raised them up for a reason. We may not understand it, but there was a purpose. He says, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. The king is there for a reason. The king was raised up and given authority by God. You need to listen to the king because you respect God. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does what he pleases. You need to be careful about the way you react to the king and the way you react to what the king says and does. Don't get yourself in the position where you are standing for an evil cause against the king. The word of the king is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? Raise your hand if God has raised you up and given you the right to challenge the authority of the government. You know, there's one thing that he says regarding that, right? Anybody remember what that is? Acts chapter 5. Peter tells the authorities that he's dealing with, for we must obey God rather than men. However, when Peter makes that proclamation, what else does he understand? That he has to be ready to accept the consequences for doing so. You decide what we should do here, but we must obey God rather than men. We're going to do what God has told us to do, but if you decide that that makes us worthy of death, what did Paul say about that? If I've done anything worthy of death, then I refuse not to die. So when we put ourselves in those situations where we feel like we're justified in saying to the authorities, no, you can't tell me that, this is what I must do no matter what you think about it, we have to be ready also to accept the consequences of what they do, because they do what they please. And that is a way to keep us, by the way, balanced in this measure. If I understand that, yes, I might be able to reject something if it is contrary to the commands of God, but that I also have to accept whatever consequences that comes with that, it makes me not be too quick to jump to the decision that this is God's will that I not do it simply because I don't want to do it. Nobody would ever do that, right? No one would ever say, oh, I don't really like that. I don't want to do that. I'd rather do this. So let me say it's God's will. Of course, people do that all the time. They justify their decisions and wrap them in the clothing of religion. And what we're being warned here is that the king has been given authority by God. And again, as Romans talks about it, he doesn't bear the sword for nothing. He can act. And he might act. And so when I challenge the king, then I put myself at risk. And that's what I think he's talking about. The word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. Verse 5. Wisdom. Wisdom lets you know where that line is. Now remember, earlier in this book, he says that there's a time for everything, right? There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. That there's a time for this. Wisdom is what helps us know what time it is. And so, how serious should we take this matter? Verse 7. Well, actually verse 7. I don't want to skip verse 6. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be. This is where this goes back to where he started the chapter with. I don't know everything that's going on. I don't have the capacity to know and understand everything that's going on. So I need to be very careful about making judgments about things that I may have no idea why something is. Was Rome a kind and generous government? In the beginning, it sort of was. As it got more and more corrupt, it got less so. By Nero's time, it wasn't kind and generous at all, especially not toward Christians. So why did God allow Nero to become emperor in Rome? His purposes, we don't always see it. The only way we can understand and know his purposes is how? If he reveals it. Yes, sir.
That's a better answer. But what did pop into my mind is the part where it says that God still works all for good also, which even makes it more complicated to understand sometimes.
Yeah, there's nothing easy about it. And that's the whole point. That's the point that he's making. And so if I understand how limited I am, how cautious does that need create the need for me to be with regard to such things? And so he goes on, he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. Now those are parallel statements. We can't even control our own lives. If we could, if we had the power over the spirit and I could say to my spirit, no, you're not leaving me. You're staying in my body and keeping me alive. The implication is that Jesus did have power to retain or send away the spirit. On the cross, what did he say? After he said it's finished, he said to the Lord, into thy hands I commit my spirit. I'm giving you my spirit. We can't do that. We don't get to choose. When our spirit leaves us, what happens? We die. If we had the power, how many people would die? Not very many. Most of us don't want to. Most of us fight to stay alive. But no man has that power. God has that power. Hezekiah was going to die. He was told that he was going to die. He petitioned God, and God agreed to do what? Extend his life. He extended it 15 more years. He was going to die that very night. But God has the power to command the Spirit to stay. We don't have that power. No man has that power. There's no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. There's not any way for us to... There's a myth that's pervasive among especially blues musicians, that certain people have signed contracts with the devil. It's actually a whole myth built up around it. There's some crossroads down in Mississippi somewhere. I don't know where they're at. Supposedly you go to the crossroads and you can meet with the devil. And these people have signed away their soul and promised that the devil can have their soul if he'll give them the gift of playing whatever it is that they wanted. Robert Johnson was the guitar. I don't believe that Robert Johnson made a deal with the devil, but there's a myth. We can't, through giving ourselves to evil, accomplish our purposes. That's what he says here. There's no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. Wickedness isn't the way out. It doesn't get us what we're looking for. It may seem to be shorter, it may seem to be easier. There's even times in life where it seems like the wicked are getting the advantage, right? But what the writer is saying is, it doesn't work that way. You give your life to wickedness, you're not going to gain anything from it. All this I observed, verse 9, while applying my heart to all that's done under the sun, when a man had power over man to his hurt. Authority exists in this world. Human beings have authority over one another. Sometimes they abuse that authority. They use it to hurt people rather than to help people. That happens. And what this text seems to be dealing with is he is trying to figure out why that happens, why it's allowed, and how we should react to it. And what does he ultimately say? Be righteous, do the right thing, listen to those who have authority over you, and trust God. That's what these verses are saying. You don't understand everything, you can't understand everything, and you can't really do anything about it. So just do what is right. Seek to walk and do the things that the time is right to do. Yes, sir.
You said time, and I'm thinking also, God deals on much bigger timelines than I think we can even really, like Egypt, for example. I guess he told Abraham well in advance what's going to happen with the Israelites. 400 years, and then he was going to punish Egypt because of what they did. And so that does give you some comfort that they will be held accountable, but the timeline can be longer.
The timeline is always longer. And in fact, the longest timeline is what? I'm sorry? Okay, the return of Christ. And of that time. When's that going to happen? Who knows? I don't know. When's the end of the world going to be? I don't know. I don't know that time. Now see, and you talk about God deals with longer timelines. That's what the suggestion was made. The truth is that God functions outside of time. Time is something that only happens under the sun. Time, in fact, is created by the things that God created in the universe. Go back and read Genesis 1. When it talks about making the greater light and the lesser light, and He made the stars also, that whole little discussion about all of those He did it to create what? Days, months, seasons, years. He put those things out there to create time for us. And it has a place and it has a role in our lives, but God functions outside of time. So Peter talks about it in terms of, with God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. He's not constrained by time the way that we are. And so, for instance, when He tells us that the time is at hand, what does He mean by that? Does He mean that tomorrow something's going to happen? No, because He's not constrained by time the way we are. Are we in the last days? How long have we been in the last days? That's a lot of days. At least to us. But to God, it's not. And so we have to understand that. There may be something going on that we know nothing about. And not one of us has the power to change what's going on. In fact, a whole bunch of people together don't have the power to change what's going on a lot of times. There's a lot of people trying to change what a certain world leader is doing right now. He's still doing it. We have to understand that there's a time, and there is a proper person in place, and maybe I should say group. I think the state falls underneath that category to a large extent when you're talking about things like that. The government is raised up to be an avenger against evil. God used Assyria to punish Israel. God used Babylon to punish Israel. God used other people to punish them. He used Rome to destroy Jerusalem. And then He brought Rome down when it was time. And He used someone to do that. But we don't know. And so what He's saying to us is you need to be very careful. And you need to try to walk wisely. And use your life in a way that reflects the righteousness of God. At all times and in all circumstances. So that's the government's place in the world and our response to it. And then the next few verses, and we probably don't have time. You going to ring the bell? Give me 60 seconds.
Already a minute over.
I know, give me 60 more seconds. 10, 11, 12, and 13. Let's read them real quick. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This is vanity, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily. The heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before Him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Evil is not always punished in time. That's the big picture of those 4 verses. There are bad people, And they will not always be punished in time. And when they're not, that has an effect on the way other people behave. And so that proliferates wickedness in the world. But in the end, the wicked doesn't prolong his days. Ultimately, they will be judged. Now, obviously we didn't give full treatment to these verses, so if the Lord wills next week, the Lord wills next week, we will we'll look at these a little bit closer and break them down and talk about them a little bit more. But just to understand that in the world that we live in, we get frustrated when justice isn't served. He's telling us, you know what, under the sun sometimes justice isn't served. That's just part of it. It's part of what happens. Because people don't always do what they're supposed to do. Governments don't always do what they're supposed to do. And so sometimes evil goes unchecked. Got to stop. Thank you for your presence and participation. And thank you guys that are watching online.